Good day. We are glad that you have joined the Constitution American Life with us, the Friends of Publius, and a specific welcome to our teachers and students for our second session on the philosophical and historical foundations of America's political system, where we will address the formation and influence of early state constitutions on the ideas of self-governance and individual rights within a Republican form of government. So, FOPS, it seems to me that there are two things that a functional constitutional government should be able to achieve. One is, provide for the common defense. Every functional constitutional government should be able to defend its citizens from, foreign enemies. And two is to fund the basic functions of government. So, students, teachers, and the curious, we bring this episode to you on the eve of what may be the 22nd funding gap and the 11th federal employee furlough since 1980. In that same period, and Professor Williams may check me on this, but in that same period, there have been zero, yes, I said zero, government shutdowns by any other country in the democratic universe. I guess this fact proves me wrong. America is indeed exceptional. So, gents, I am wondering, do you see this continual inability by the United States of America to fund the basic functions of government as a design error or a user error? Professor Williams, is this a design error or a user error?
This is all user error. I think, I think it's clear that we've been able to pass budgets. We've been able to get through partisanship in the past, and things are just, the culture is a little bit different now on the Hill. So I think there's ways that this could be done if you had different people elected into office.
Mr. Kavanaugh.
A budget. What's a budget? I thought we went from one CR to the next continuing resolution to the next continuing resolution. I would agree probably 90% with Professor Williams that it's operator error, but I think there's some issue baked into the cake, as I've ranted and raved about it many times, and it's nice to see some actual really smart people talking about minority control of government lately. So but overall right now, operator error, no matter how badly we mess up, we still should be able to do this with the tools we have, and we're struggling.
Professor Moore?
I'd go. I might go. Well, I think it's user error, but I'm willing to concede that maybe the Senate. Some of the criticisms at the founding were that the Senate didn't have an increased role in the funding mechanisms of the system. So maybe if that total control of the alleged budget wouldn't have been given to the House, and maybe the Senate could have had a little more power in that process, maybe. But I actually think it's a logical conclusion of the Reagan Revolution in many ways. Government is the problem, is his big speech. And so I think that mantra has really taken root within their primarily, I think, in the Republican Party. And if government is the problem, as Reagan espoused, I think they've picked up that mantle and really run with it. And and it's interesting, your ground zero and your statistics there were the 80s. But I do think it's user error with maybe a smidge of a design flaw.
And again, this is no surprise that I find myself in a distinct minority on this panel here, because I fundamentally believe it's all in the design and structure of our government. Because to say it's user error is to say that somehow the American people and its representative form of government are somewhat so distinctly different than, Canadians and Germans and other human beings around the universe.
But wait a minute, they don't have the debt we do.
What's that?
I'm going out on a limb here. I don't think they have the debt we do. So I think that plays into it as well.
Well, yeah, and again, the reason I would argue that we have the debt that we do is in the design of our system of government there. And again, remember, the reason why ground zero is 1980, Professor Moore, is that there is a constitutional interpretation in 1976 that really changes in many ways the budgetary process. And again, Professor Williams is probably the expert here on this, but so much of this has to do with the constitutional provisions that allow each house to make their own rules. All right. And so, and again, these agencies or institutions, to me, would not be able to make such flagrant rules that violate, to me, democratic principles if the American people. So, in that sense, I would agree with you. There might be some user error in the fact that we have very little accountability in our system. But the rules of the House and the rules of the Senate, which are not enumerated constitutionally, they are left up to those branches. To me, again, as Professor Kavanaugh said, really does allow not just a minority, but a super minority of people in our structure, all right, to drive the bus in the budgetary process. So again, we hopefully we'll be able to touch on this somewhere at a later point on there. But I was just curious if any of you are with me on this, and of course, no, which makes me the lone eagle, lone hummingbird.
I've ranted and raved and yelled at kids to get off my yard about the minority control throughout the system. So I think, but the question is, do we have the tools to be able to pass a budget? And the answer is yes. Do we have the will to pass a budget? That's a whole nother thing. The trouble is the tools have allowed for some people, right? So, but can we? Yeah. Will we? I don't know. And by the way, when did we get Sanford Levinson on our panel? I thought that was Dave Richmond. We need to change his name to Professor Sanford Levinson, Sandy Levinson. Holy cow.
I'm going to take that as a compliment. Why, thank you, Professor Kavanaugh. No, nobody's ever associated with me with any academic, and academics don't want to be associated with me in any way. So thank you, gentlemen, for your insights on our current event of the week. And so let's use some of that maybe energy here to transition to our specific topic for today's session, the formation and influence of early state constitutions. And let's start with you, Professor Kavanaugh. I'd like to begin this discussion where I think, and I'm probably wrong here as well, that the delegates to Philadelphia began, and that is with the Virginia Plan. All right. So we get to Philadelphia, and my understanding is Madison presents this Virginia Plan. I'm curious, what ideas, experience, factors influenced Madison's design of the Virginia Plan? Because I'm assuming a lot of it has to do not only with the British experience, but with state constitutions that were in existence.
Oh, I would say much more with state constitutions in existence. And I think, and Tim can correct me on this, but I would encourage, and I'll include this in the links for references, but holy smokes, all you have to do is look at Madison's Vices on the Political System of the United States. And that was published just a month before the Virginia Plan was presented by Governor Randolph of Virginia. And Madison wrote it, but he deferred to the head of the Virginia delegation. But for students, if you look through, and it's only 12 articles, and it's really fascinating to read through. I mean, he's calling out individual states for their lack of supporting treaties. He has little job shot at Rhode Island and their monetary policies. And really, I think, and I pulled out I don't want to hold up a book because I tend to do that a lot, but well, I will, David, since you gave me the look.
Well, we are technically kind of an educational, program here, so books are good.
Writings, and this is edited by Jack Rakoff, Stanford professor, who is a giant in the field of this early American history. But I wrote in my notes, just going through that the vices are like a negative constitution, what not to do. And he's really calling out the states for the things that they're doing. And if the students look through this, you'll see you can say, oh my gosh, is he writing about Federalist 10 here? Because he's talking about this common interest of passion and reuniting people. Is he talking about Fed 39 The idea of federalism. They're all, you can see the kernels of ideas that he has in his vices. So I think, and he compiled that sitting at Montpelier, looking at what had been going on at the state level. So you talked about what happened in Great Britain. I think it's more so what's been happening at the states, and so that's
and the reason the reason I find this so interesting that I wanted to start off with this is, here is the man who's credited with the label father of the Constitution, whether right or wrong. He's got that label in history. Although he may not have been the brightest member of the convention, he was clearly the one who had worked the most to prepare for the convention and the discussions and creation. And here he comes with a plan. All right. Predominantly, as you say, Professor Kavanaugh, based upon his experiences in observing and living through state constitutions. And to the best of my knowledge, most of his plan, by the time we get to September and they vote on the final draft, most of his plan is rejected, which then leads me to believe that most of the delegates didn't have the same experiences or lessons learned from the state constitutions there. Gentlemen, what do you think?
I don't know percentage-wise to say most of the Virginia plan was rejected. I think
he was batting about 500.
I would say close up, because you have 12 provisions in the vices of the American political system, right? And you've got 14 articles in the Virginia plan, and hopefully the students actually read the document itself, not someone's analysis or what the textbook tells you. Read it, and you will see these kernels of the supremacy clause. You will see the kernels of the guarantee clause for Republican government. Obviously, where I think it comes off the rails is his idea of representation. Back to our lead-in discussion about is it baked into the cake, or is it operator error? And had we gone with Madison's original proposals about these two branches of government and how they're determined, as well as the executive, how the executive was to be determined, I think that's where we've gotten away from his original plan and his council of revision and the national veto, obviously. So I'd say it's I'm going to go with Professor Moore and say about 500.
Yeah, I think the proportional piece of the Virginia plan is interesting. There are some historians that say the reason he proposes the Virginia plan is obviously it was going to be proposed by somebody from Virginia, but the duplicity argument about this is, if he gets the proportional representation in the House and the Senate, the state of Virginia is the big dog in the country. So in other words, there's this school of historiography that takes a kind of a sideways glance that this is kind of a bold, is not so subtle in many ways, attempt to put Virginia at the top of the heap that would drive this country in terms of representation in both of the upper and lower houses. Now, he obviously doesn't get that, but there is some evidence that I think can play into that argument, that it's all about, the influence, as to Chris's point about state constitution. So therefore, let's put Virginia in charge of everything. So.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if we call that a tie or whatever, that we get a branch that is proportional and then one is equal. My understanding is, September, Madison's, he's pretty, gloomy and doomy about the Senate and that equal representation. But there's also that veto over state government, to me, which was a key part to his thinking about creating a United States, a central government with enough power to create a new American identity, and he loses that as well. All right. Now, yes, he does get a supremacy clause there, but in the last analysis, we know that states are going to have a tremendous amount of authority in this new federal union here, and again, everything I've read says that Madison leaves Philadelphia in a state of melancholy there. So again, I do agree with you. I think kids really need to look at the Virginia plan in either unit 1 or 2 if we're talking about state constitutions. So Professor Moore, when we
Well,
do
to further your point, David, it's interesting. Later in October, he writes this very famous letter to Jefferson, and the gloom and doom really comes out. I mean, it's like 6 pages long, and he's supposed to be writing Jefferson and kind of summarizing what the convention did. The first 4 pages are like the sky. I mean, it's Chicken Little. The sky is falling. I mean, to this point of him not batting. His batting average wasn't really phenomenal at the convention. So, I mean, that furthers your point about how melancholy he was about his quote failures at the convention to get a preponderance of what he wanted.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Which leads me to say that Dolly should be getting a lot of credit here for the ultimate ratification, because she kind of bucks him up and tells him to get back on the horse, right, and go do what he does, the kind of thing. Am I correct there, Professor Moore? I know you have a certain
only
affinity
in the
towards
broadest sense. Only in the broadest sense.
Okay, I'm not going to.
No, just leave it alone, David.
Okay, all right. We won't touch that anymore, or
No, thank you.
maybe in a later session. But when we do talk about this, Professor Moore, and you read some just the basic textbooks, we tend to talk about it as how these ideas of these state constitutions influence the national constitution, and how you see these things within the state constitutions in the national constitution, so forth and so on. But I'm curious about what ideas, clauses, powers, rights found in the state constitutions were rejected by the framers. That is, what did they see, kind of building on, I think, a little bit of what Chris had said, what did they see as examples of really bad government that they didn't want to get anywhere near the national constitution?
Yeah, what they don't want. Well, I think it might be easy to kind of parse it out in terms of there's structural stuff that they were rejecting in how the structures of the state constitutions were. But I also think there's some procedural things that they reject. On the structural side, in a sense, they're rejecting legislative supremacy, although I'm not convinced of that 100%, because I believe the Constitution, the first branch and the most important branch is Congress. But the fact that they create explicitly stated textual things called the executive and the judiciary, I think is a rejection of the legislative supremacy that was much more prevalent during the Articles phase in the state constitutions. Now, there's the state constitutions have 3 branches, but the legislature is definitely supreme. So I think they reject that structurally. I think they in a sense are rejecting there's a couple of executives in the states that are strong. I think they reject that because there's not a whole lot of powers, and textually you have to do some interpretation to get a strong executive, I think, in the Constitution. I think they also they're rejecting the executive council. I think 11 states had executive. Let me check that. Yeah, I think 11 states had executive councils. So they reject that. Now, kind of the Senate sort of becomes that by advice and consent and its shared treaty power. But so they're rejecting that. I think they also they're clearly rejecting Vermont, Georgia, and Pennsylvania's unicameralism. That's an easy one. I think they also are rejecting how executives got the governorships. Almost all of, I think only New York, and New York was the first actually to have a popularly elected governor. All the other states had the legislature or combinations of their legislature, upper, lower, elect the governors. So they're rejecting that. In the final constitution. Now, if you know the Virginia plan, Madison actually wants that kind of quasi-parliamentary system. I'd also say that when they create an executive, they're kind of, in a sense, repudiating what I see at a national level, a parliamentary system that operated within the articles. There were committees that basically ran the country. I say that that's kind of an executive in the articles, but the fact they create, a clearly textually based executive, I think, is certainly a rejection of parliamentary system at the national level. But and the two most interesting things, to go to the procedural side, they reject, in my estimation, two really important things. They reject, back in the day, it was called instructing your representatives. And this kind of, historians kind of think this may have come out of the New England town hall world, where they had this really rigorous insistence that local towns and communities had the right to tell their representatives to go do exactly what they wanted to do. Those were called instructions. And it was based in kind of a delegate theory of representation. So these state constitutions, I think, again, 11 of them have this instruction principle. Well, the national constitution rejects that, which essentially is saying, and Madison's filtering says, we're more interested in the Burkean trusteeship. So they reject the instruction mechanism in the state constitution. The second thing I think that's important to note, they also reject how state constitutions operated, how they operated when they wanted to amend the state constitution. Legislatures in state constitutions had wide, what's called constituent power, to do constitutional amendments. Now that was quite prevalent, and this is where Massachusetts is so unique, because they're the first, actually. Yeah, they're the first to have a constitution. It was rejected by the people because they didn't think enough people input was put into it in 1778. So they had to have a redo, and eventually they got the Constitution of 1780. But all the states had this very easy way to amend their constitutions, just the legislature did it. Now, again, a combination of upper lower houses, and there's some variations in there. But clearly the U.S. Constitution rejects that state practice of legislative-based amending processes. So I think those two, I would say those two procedural state features are clearly repudiated in the national constitution.
Tim, Dave, can I ask Tim a question? I just thought of this. Did state constitutions have any type of supremacy clause vis-a-vis the articles?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
Because if you think about the supremacy clause into the Constitution, which is out of Philly, I'm wondering, because obviously the articles, I mean, you have a state constitution, the articles are thrown together, Articles of Confederation.
Yeah.
Anything in state constitutions establishing themselves as the supreme law of the land for our state vis-a-vis the Articles.
Well, yeah, I would say I wouldn't go that far, because there isn't the intense federalism issues within states, although there are, because the states are always arguing about how they should draw the upper house districts. Should they be drawn the same way, or to what extent different than their lower house, representational schemes? So I'd say the federalism piece isn't there as much at the state level that would create this necessity for a supremacy clause.
So, Professor Williams, we start out, obviously talking about the influence of state constitutions on the writing of our national Constitution from their experiences in the 1770s, 1780s. I am wondering, do you feel that state government, state constitutions, state policy, state politics have continued to influence national thoughts on governance and rights throughout American history?
Yeah, I think the short answer is I do, but teasing out what's influencing what is tricky. But I definitely do, and I think we could talk about some very current things going on around some controversial federal policies, whether it's abortion or it's gun rights or other cultural issues, where I think what's happening in some of the states does influence what's happening at the national sphere. What makes it complicated, I think, is that at least for the last 90 years or so, so much of our politics has been nationalized that I don't think we're taking advantage of this structural feature where states are supposed to be places where we experiment with policies and maybe experiment with trying to change certain types of behavior and then thinking about how that could apply more nationally. I don't think we as thoughtfully do that now. Now, I do think there are like examples like you think about President Obama's healthcare policy that ultimately gets passed. Well, he basically took a healthcare system that was in Massachusetts and he federalized it, he nationalized it, right? And part of that argument was like, well, it worked really well here. This is something that Governor Romney was in favor of. It's something that Republicans could back. So I also think there's a flip side of this, and I'm not sure how y'all going to feel about this. I was thinking about like the civil rights movement and to the extent to which one of the strategies of that movement were to go to places like Alabama and Mississippi, where they knew that there were certain state laws and state cultures that if they could just provoke the kind of actions that they know that they could provoke and get that seen through a national media, that it might have this effect of really changing people's perceptions, not just about what's happening in Alabama and Mississippi, but what should be happening throughout the entire country. I think obviously the extent that we have national media at that time helps that, but that's another way I think that there are examples of what's happening in states definitely influencing kind of what we're thinking nationally, national policies.
Would you say weed and sex is another set of issues that the states are?
Wait! I'm sorry, I'm hard of hearing.
I mean the states.
Weed and sex.
Yeah.
As separate things. Okay. I mean, it seems to me the states have been dabbling around with legalization forever, and I think it's forcing a discussion at the national level. And I think the marriage equality, I think, is another one of those. I think is at least the way I read it.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, there's all these types of examples that students could definitely find, but I found that like in 2004, right, right after this decision was made about, well, a lot of states started passing laws making same-sex marriage illegal, and you can see that happening today with abortion. You can see that happening with drugs. I think there's definitely that kind of back and forth going on.
Yeah.
I was going to say that, Michael, to illustrate your point, how our national politics has worked its way into the states here in North Dakota, which is a solidly red state. And you just have to have a Republican after your name and you're going to be okay. We have people that are trying to change the way we run elections because they're worried about, this idea of election integrity, to the point where they want to do away with voting machines. And it's like, wait a minute, why?
Right.
And so what you're seeing is this blowback from this nationalization of these issues that have even worked this way here. And I'm thinking, this is what they call a cure looking for a disease.
Yeah.
So it's kind of wacky.
Yeah. I mean, I think
our county came within one vote of removing voting machines in the next election cycle, and you just really, you think there was some shenanigans that elected who is currently the Speaker of the House. Again, we're a red area of California, but it just baffles the mind there. So I'm sorry, Mike, you were going to say.
Oh no, related to this, a resource I found while thinking about this question, we'll share it in the notes. Some law professors have talked about this idea of the quote democracy principle that they say is inherent in so many state constitutions. The state constitutions are inherently more democratic than the national constitution, and some might see that as it can be a very positive thing. The flip side is it can be controversial, right? Because what you're both describing is basically the will of a majority at the state level to get something done that is going to be much harder to get done at the national level, right? So it's like you go to the national Congress, you can't get certain things done, so you go back to your state and you just try to implement the change there, which could be a really good thing depending on the issue, and it could be a really bad thing.
Yes, Wisconsin man, you have some insights on this.
Well, I can't help but think back in May of 1776, there was this intense debate in the Continental Congress. And the debate, well, there was a lot of them, but one of them was, if we declare independence, should we also then tell the states what kinds of constitution, because they knew they were going to tell the states write constitutions, and that actually is this resolution May 10 and May 15 of 76. But in Congress, they were talking, here was the question, because some people at the state level were saying, give us a template. Give us a template of the kind of state constitution you want us to write. Now think of, like, here's one of these interesting hypothetical questions in history. What if the Continental Congress would have said, okay, we're going to declare independence, write your constitutions and write them this way. Now think about, we wouldn't even have this discussion about state constitutions' influence on anything because it would all be top down. But I mean, I find that fascinating to think about if that would have occurred, but they didn't. And I think they knew that if they did that, the Union wouldn't hold together, because that's just too much like kind of the unitary system they were under Parliament. But that's a fascinating thing to think about if they would have issued a template, to the states.
What did like figure it out on your own, boys? We're busy trying to fund the war, or what?
Well, there was some of that, because there's all kinds of factions in Continental Congress. Maybe we can get into this later. But the Continental Congress was full of factions, and they were shifting all the time as well. So the Continental Congress knows that, and so there's no way they can impose a template on Constitution. And plus, these state colonies and now newly formed states, or soon to be formed states, there's going to be tremendous resistance to that. But I find it interesting that some people in the states were asking for a template.
Mike, you're going to say?
Well, I mean, yeah, because you can think about constitutions as just designing the structure, right? Which it sounds like maybe that's what they're asking for.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think constitutionalism is so like intersects with culture. It surprises me that state officials were even asking for it. I guess I came across this quote.
It was a minority.
I came across this. I didn't realize this. It's from the Texas Supreme Court. It's a 1992 case there, and the court declared that the Texas Constitution must be understood, unlike the U.S. Constitution, to, quote, reflect Texas's values, customs, and traditions, and thus must therefore be interpreted in view of the, quote, experiences and philosophies of the state's founders, whose beliefs about self-governance were shaped by, quote, years of rugged experience on the frontier. And to me, that speaks to, that's more than just designing how power is going to flow at the state level. I mean, that is like, that's a cultural sort of dictum right there that I just found very interesting.
No allusion to what happened with Mexico, and the old bit there.
No, just presentism, man.
So, Chris, I kind of want to build off of something Tim just said. It seems to me that Federalist 10 is one of the seminal works to describe the American style of governance and constitutionalism, and it's obviously a key expression of the Madisonian theory of government. I'm wondering, to what extent is Madison's construct in Federalist 10 about faction? And Mr. Moore just said, the Continental Congress was fraught with factions, and they were constantly shifting here. I'm wondering to what extent his ideas in Federalist 10 are influenced by his observations of state governments.
Oh, I'd say a great deal. I mean, as I alluded to earlier when I was talking about vices, there's a phrase in there describing factions, and he's talking about factions within the state governments. So I mean, he's already again, for the students, go back and read this, because you can, when you guys will see this, it's like, oh my gosh, wait a minute, he's got an idea for a future paper right here, and it's gonna be called Fed 10, because he talks about a common interest and passion. So he's almost, it's like he's, just reworking some of his prior work. So yeah, he's influenced by what he sees when he writes Fed 10. But I want to, go back, and I've learned this from Tim. At the time, Fed 10 was not seen as one of the important Fed papers, right? Or the Federalist, as it was called, as referred to. That becomes a much more modern AP government kind of thing, where you've got to start reading this Federalist 10, and and I know in the We the People lexicon, it's the factions are really important. The whole idea that how do you get rid of them? You can't, because they're inevitable, and the disease is worse than the cure, and air is the fire is liberty is the faction. All those great quotable bits in the Fed 10. But I would encourage students. Yes, the definition of factions and how you control factions and expand the sphere, make the republic bigger. He takes Montesquieu and the whole concept of small republics and turns them on their head. He's got a great line in there about democracies. He kind of rips on democracies. They die as quickly as they do violently. But his complaint about democracies is they don't protect property. And if you read further in Fed 10, I think the key parts where he talks about the object of government, the first object of government is protect these different faculties in men from which property arises. And if you read those passages in that paragraph, those become really important to understand that, well, I see where Mr. Madison is going with this, because, gee, who has property? He does. Many of these other guys have property. Tim,
Yeah, I think to further that a little bit, I think I would say his Fed 10 argument. Well, I got a snarky comment about it too. There is this book by Willie Paul Adams. Teachers, this should be on your shelf. This is your one-stop shop for all things. If you want to know about state constitutions. But Willie Paul Adams makes the argument that it's kind of a tangential argument, that Madison's Fed 10 argument, he's seen this for 15 years. This is not a new argument at all. He's seen factions. He's seen them he's in the Articles of Congress. He's seen them at the national level. He's seen them at the state level. This is not a new argument. He's just articulating what everybody knows and experiences at the state level. He's experienced at the national level. The other thought, to relate to Chris's point about the influence of what's going on at states, there's an argument to be made, and I think Gordon Wood makes this argument. Wood thinks, and I don't want to really argue with Gordon Wood, but
you will.
But Wood's argument is Madison gets his Fed 10 idea from the Virginia fights about the religious assessment in Virginia, because he sees where one particular faction is dominant religiously in Virginia, and they're running roughshod over everybody. So he wants to disestablish that. He wants to disestablish the funding mechanism and create a plethora of factions on an equal plane. And there will be, in Virginia will be a much better place. So Wood makes the argument that Fed 10 is actually rooted in Madison's, which goes to Chris's point, what's going on at the state level. And that's going on in other states too, in terms of religious sects and stuff. But so I think, there's two things about Madison's Fed 10. I'm prone to think that he's seen this. This is just the way that this is the way societies are. And now he has to add the geographic piece in Fed 10, increase the scale. But I think it's there, and he's just articulating a kind of an axiom in a lot of ways.
Mike?
Yeah, can one of you help me understand this? That if Madison gets his if he gets the Virginia plan, does he write Federalist 10? Because it's really I mean, what's going on in Madison's head is really interesting. We've already talked about it. He doesn't get his plan. He's upset afterwards. Then he gets to work and he starts defending this system that he thought was not as good as the one he wanted. And to me, Federalist 10 is all about this. We have this system that's dividing up powers, right? And I always saw the Virginia plan was one, but you'd get much quicker, more effective government because you're not going to have these places where maybe factions could hold things up. So, like, what is going on in terms of, does he have to make this faction argument if he gets his Virginia plan or not? Or is it a completely different system now?
I would say, well, first of all, I want to jump back to something Tim has said about religion, because again, the document I referred to, Vices, he brings that up in Vices about religion in Vices. And it really kind of talks about how that creates factions as well. And you can see the seeds for religious liberty within Vices. And Mike, to your point, yes, I think he does write it. The emphasis may be different, because I think one of the reasons also he writes Fed 10 is because, like, hey, we can't have a republic over such a large area.
Exactly.
And so, and so Madison's like, well, let me flip this. I think that is probably the most radical thing about Fed 10 is that he takes that whole concept that republics must be small to be effective, and he's saying, well, no, because we expand the sphere. So how do you control factions? You have a bunch of them, and you have a bunch of them by making the country bigger. So I think he would probably still write it as a rebuttal to some anti-federalist arguments.
Okay.
I think Chris is exactly right. I think the unique thing about Fed 10 is he takes on Montesquieu, and that's Chris's point. I mean, in a lot of ways, what's the thing about weddings? Something old, something new. In Fed 10, I'd say the faction argument is something old. That's not unique at all. What's unique is he's got this massive thing called the United States now. He's trying to take an old argument, and he's seen how big states, small states, and there's shifting alliances between big states in Continental Congress too. So I think the uniqueness of it is the geography piece at a continental scale. The old axiom is the factions, because that's been around.
That makes sense. I guess my only other question would be, if he gets this PR system that he wants at both levels, he wants to create a United States, which means he wants fewer factions to have that ability to be around. So I see that he doesn't get that. So he knows these factions are going to be out there more so than they would have been in the Virginia plan. Because as we said earlier, if the Virginia plan is there, then Virginia is basically running the country, right? I mean, Virginia can get a lot done without, and just not listen to other factions. Am I following the politics right from what the structure would?
Well, but there's also the West. Virginia still, at this point, Virginia still owns huge chunks of the West. So imagine how influential Virginia is going to be if they don't give up those lands in the West.
Okay.
Like West
So
Virginia.
there's that in the mix too, Mike. Does that make sense?
A question of curiosity. So Madison's writing Federalist 10 based upon observations of state governments. That obviously influences, and he's defending the design of the national constitution. So do state governments then take these ideas after ratification, and do they begin to implement changes in their own state constitutions as far as control of faction? Well, I'm just curious about that in that one little area. Do we kind of see a rebound here? He observes it, becomes some kind of a justification for the design of the national constitution, and then we see it bounce back because if he observes this factional problem, the idea that republics have to be small in order to not have this problem seems to be on really shaky ground there, because do you see where I'm coming from on this?
No, they look, these factional Vermont's a good example. They used to be a part of, New Hampshire claimed them and New York claimed them. And it was a faction of people in this area that just decided to become their own state. And so there's a factional piece to the birth of Vermont. There's factions. There's a bunch of Connecticut folks that settle in Northeast Pennsylvania called the Wyoming Valley. I mean, there's like it's like a civil war in the Wyoming Valley for a couple of years. So those factional pieces are still going on at the state levels. And to your question directly, eventually I'll get around. No, the states are still trying to wrestle with factions. I don't think they don't solve it. In fact, the creation of the Republic of Franklin as a breakaway republic, from Kentucky and Tennessee, there's all these factions of these bigger states. They've got factions within their areas that are creating. I mean, they're having a dickens of a time to control them.
Well, that's my observation of the 21st century, Tim, is that it seems to me that at the state level, we're still seeing these factional fights that we haven't been able, the state constitutions haven't been able to design. And heck, all we do is look at Oregon and wanting to be part of greater Idaho.
Yeah, well, California, you've got factions up,
right, Northern
upstate.
California. And again, I'd argue that California, Texas, these large geographic areas with large populations are much different than quite possibly some of the New England states and middle colonies back in the 19th century. And so, but the question, as you said, the faction is still going to exist regardless of the size and population, more than likely. Chris?
Well, I think if you go back to Mike's question, about does he write this, and well, part of it is, if he gets the ability with the national veto, and students, when you read the Virginia plan, it's called the negative, right? The ability to negate laws. If they get this and they do it, if they had followed the Virginia plan, the national government would have the ability to slap down states a lot more fervently than they could have under the Constitution. But I think that therein goes back to my argument that part of Fed 10 is to take Montesquieu and give them the inverse and say, well, don't worry, this is a way to control it. He doesn't say you can still have it at your state level, but I think he's right that they are inevitable. This is part of human nature. One of the few times Madison gets human nature right.
So, Professor Moore, I do notice that most state constitutions, I think I'm interpreting this correctly, or understanding this correctly. Most state constitutions seem to have weak executives and weak judiciary or judicial branches. Yet the Constitution of 1787, in my opinion, establishes relatively strong executive and judicial branches there. How do you account for this shift in thinking from the state level to the national level when it comes to the executive and judicial branches?
Oh, David. I'm
be gentle. Be gentle.
Well, no, I'm going to take exception to your question because I don't think the way I read the original Constitution, I don't think it created a strong executive, nor do I think it created a strong court. That came with praxis. So in some ways, I think your question, I mean, it's a fair question, but I think there's a little bit of presentism. I mean, you're asking about the power of an executive that we see now, and you're asking about the power of a court that we see now. I don't see those entities back in 87, 88, 89, and the first 10 years as having strong executives. I mean,
but relatively speaking, aren't they stronger, at least on paper, than what existed at the state levels?
Yes and no. I mean, there were some states where they had a stronger executive, and yes, there were states that didn't. So I think it's a mixed bag there. But I think, so that's my snarky part of the answer here. But I would say very quickly, I mean, by the time you get to Marshall, he's carving out with his articulation of what the court's role in review would be, and certainly his nationalist decisions of Dartmouth and Cohen and McCullough and Gibbons. I think those are all pretty strong statements about national power, but also the power of that branch. And then you see, Washington was nervous about the use of his military powers in the Whiskey Rebellion. He was quite reticent to use power there. But I think the late 90s and by the time we get to the War of 1812, I think the executive is assuming more of a dominant role. And then by the time you get to Jackson, certainly that's the case. So I think it's not there at the beginning is my argument, but soon it does become there, because I think maybe the founders were naive that the executive and the courts would stay within their lanes, or tightly framed lanes in the text. And that was the anti-federalist argument. It's the anti-federalist argument about both those branches. Down the road, they do a lot of that down the road argumentation about those branches, how powerful they would become.
Which in some ways makes them, in my opinion, more on the ball than as far as the context of the argument in 1788. The anti-federalists, as far as their prediction capabilities and how it's played out, were probably more on target than the Federalists were.
One historian said anti-federalists knew men in a generic sense. Federalists knew ideas. I kind of like that.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that.
It might go to Mike's point about this cultural piece to constitutionalism. Is there's a human element to this that's beyond just simple ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So, Professor Williams, let's take the kind of the reverse of the last question I asked you. We started at how did states influence the ideas, the writing of the national constitution as far as governance and rights? And I'm wondering, can we in any way kind of flip that and both in the United States and internationally? Are there circumstances in which you see the national constitution governments influencing states? After the ratification, and we now have this federal system, to what extent do we now see that a reverse trend, and maybe not at all? Well, I'm just wondering, is there, in any way, a sense that the national now government is influencing state constitutions and state governance?
Yeah, let me see if I can answer it this way. This may not be getting at what you're actually asking. I'll give it a shot. I'm not even going to be snarky. I'm going to let Tim do it.
Ow.
That's okay. When I'm thinking these things up, I'm always thinking, okay, somebody's going to slap me around.
Okay, so this notion of federalism is a relatively kind of new idea back in the 1780s and 90s. And right now, there are about 25 countries that have a federal system, most big countries, so it's about 40% of the world's population. So I kind of hear your question. I say, okay, by designing a constitution where you're allowing for federalism, you're allowing for states to exercise autonomous power in ways that they wouldn't be able to under a unified government, right? So to the extent that that is helping to dictate what's going on at the state level, I do see it there. What's been really interesting as I kind of was delving back into this literature, it's been a while since I was looking at it. And it's not surprising. I don't think the students are going to be surprised by this, but so many places in the world that have federal systems are places that are very culturally sort of diverse. And many of these regional governments become places where state constitutions are written in ways to protect certain cultural rights that are not protected at the national level. So, and there's always going to be this push and pull between the national and the state about how far you go. So even our neighbors up to the north, right, in Canada, we know that Quebec has pushed the federal envelope as hard as they can, at one point wanting to declare that French would be the only language spoken in Quebec. And at that point, the Canadian court said, no, you can't go that far. Switzerland, there's been similar sort of issues around religion in some of their federations about if you're in a Catholic majority there's a case where if you're in a Catholic majority canton, the state government wanted to put crucifixes in all public schools because they said we're Catholic majority and our state constitution allows for this. Well, the Swiss national constitution said no, you can't go that far. But to the extent that federalism opens up space for different cultural groupings to exercise more rights as a minority, I think that's, I'm not sure if that's getting into your question, but that's kind of how I see by design, even having a federal system, you allow for that to happen. And my final sort of example for this for the students is even a place like the United Kingdom that does not have a federal system. They have gone through a process of what's in England called devolution, though, right? And I couldn't find today, I don't think there is an actual Welsh or Scottish constitution per se, but there are acts, Scottish acts and Welsh acts that are giving those populations more and more power over their day-to-day governing, which is really not at all what the historical precedent has been in the United Kingdom. So even in places as unified as United Kingdom historically, we're seeing this like federalism sort of process kind of seeping into these political systems.
Well, let me phrase it this way. And again, I do appreciate the way that you worded it about federal systems and creating this zone of autonomy, and sovereignty or whatever, and, for some free and independent thinking amongst the states. It seems to me that Madison's Virginia plan wants to diminish that autonomy and sovereignty
Yes.
to a significant degree in the negative power, as Chris talks about, loses that. All right. And so the Philadelphia Convention that's ratified, I'd agree with you. It seems to me there's very little, except maybe through the Commerce Clause, in which the national government's going to be able to impose certain things upon the states. But when we get to the Reconstruction Amendments, it seems to me that with the enforcement clauses and also the very language, especially the 14th Amendment, this is going to give the national government great latitude, especially through the 20th century concept of incorporation, to impose a kind of a top-down value system when it comes to rights. And now we may be living in a period in which we're seeing pushback by state governments, and we now have a court that is much more friendlier to state sovereignty, pushing back against this national, authority there. But does that seem to help clarify?
No, it does. I mean, yeah, and it's very generous of you to just reframe the question and then provide what is like, that's the answer. I mean, you're exactly right. I would say it's even, you could see this definitely through the Reconstruction Amendments. You can see it also just through the growth of what we might call the administrative state, others might call the deep state, just what executive agencies can do by using the power of holding back money. I mean, you think about what the education department is allowed to do or gets away with in states because they just say, we're not going to give you certain revenues. The same thing, speed laws, like highway speed laws. So yeah, there's been a definite growth of more of a top-down national ideas about how power should be distributed and rights being forced on the states.
Tim, is it accurate for me to say that didn't really exist until the Reconstruction Amendments, or did the original Constitution have some element of the national government being able to, in some ways, to create a national identity? And
I'd say, well, yes, sort of. I think there's an argument to be made. Madison does get his way. He creates a national economy in saying the commerce power and the contract clause. Remember, he's also repudiating. Talk about the previous question: are the founders repudiating anything at the state level? They're repudiating all kinds of state economic policies. And I think the contract clause is exhibit A on that. Like, you're not going to issue paper money, and you're not going to screw around and do, debtor laws and that kind of stuff. So I think there is a national identity. I'd say it's a pretty thin identity because The argument is what's created is a national commercial republic through these financial arrangements within the Constitution. So yeah, I would say yes to a point, but the identity isn't anything the way how we would configure the word today. I think a commercial republic is created.
I think, Tim, you're alluding to Marshall and those early decisions that he makes in those cases that you listed. Holy smokes, that is solidifying that national, economic identity, because, and now we're talking the necessary and proper clause, which I see the enforcement clauses, David, that you list in the Reconstruction Amendments that start there. That really is just a continuation of the necessary and proper, which, Marshall alludes to in McCulloch. You have the right to coin money, you have the right to borrow money. In the early 1800s, we did not have debit cards, and so you got to put that money somewhere. So
go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
I think that does create that somewhat of a national economic identity, but I think you still see, oh my goodness, people are still beholden to their states. I mean, we are today, and people were then. I think we always will be.
Especially if, from what Professor Williams has told, especially in Texas, because they're all rugged individualists out there.
When he was talking about the Swiss and putting the crucifixes in the classroom, I thought we had actually gone back to Texas for a second.
So one last point of clarification, when they talk about consistent principles, all right, in the state constitutions that influence the national constitution, I kept coming across this notion of popular sovereignty. All right. And part of me is really disturbed by that. One, to what extent, and I guess, what's the definition of popular sovereignty in the 1780s? Okay, read a book. You want me to?
No.
Is there a
I can
specific
answer the
chapter?
question.
I've got the book.
There was no fixed meaning to that. In fact, a lot of people, Willie Paul Adams has a fascinating section in this one chapter where he says, essentially, democracy and republicanism, representative democracy, was a dirty word. And he traces kind of this evolution of how folks had to morph it to mean something positive. And of course, the Federalists, are ultimately responsible there. But popular sovereignty is very squishy because states always, this term pops up all over the literature, right? There's all kinds of speeches and newspaper, it's all over the place, but they're always scared to death of it. They're always scared to death of what that could actually mean. So they wrestle with the meaning. And Willie Paul Adams also has an interesting thought. Look, there are principles and then there are forms. There are principles that we espouse, blah, 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 blah. How those principles are implemented is all over the experimental map in the 1780s. So I think popular sovereignty is a phrase you see, but the states are wrestling with variant forms of what that means and how far they're willing to go. They're not. None of them are going to be Rousseau on this.
Go ahead, Chris.
I'm glad they weren't Rousseau. That's all.
Go ahead, Mike.
I think you're absolutely right, Tim. And I think there's they know of the international examples too of what popular sovereignty looks like in France and Haiti, which is right. But I agree that there's probably a wide spectrum of how it is being defined, but it's definitely not divine right of kings. It's a notion that people have some control over the decisions. Right now, the extent of that control is where it's going to be contested. And I just want to point out, the advantage that states have, and even in terms of forming identities, is that most states all of our states make it much easier to amend their constitutions than the national constitution. And I would encourage, So in terms of keeping up with what the identity of a place is, one way you do that is you amend the forms to reflect what the values are. And to the extent that states have been able to do that and do that rather successfully, I think it leads to some scholars would say that there's more popular sovereignty, there's more small d democracy in states because states are able to keep up with this growing tendency of Americans to trust democracy than we did 240 years ago. So,
or trust democracy, or maybe distrust what may be happening at certain levels. Case in point would be Ohio, where you saw a lot of people turn out to make sure they could preserve how they amended their constitution. Same thing is happening in our state as well. So you start to see people trying to protect that idea of keeping the people as sovereign, not some state government, or maybe even not some national government.
So, wow, that time really passed by for some reason this evening.
Well, they were great questions. They were great questions.
Oh,
Dave.
yes, outstanding, I imagine. So as we do, ladies and gentlemen, students, teachers, we'd like to end our sessions with some insights, recommendations, final thoughts by our scholars here. So Professor Kavanaugh.
Oh, good. I get to go first.
Yes.
Students, know what happens in your state. We've talking about state constitutions, and the judges. This is an easy judge question. To take the discussion and say, well, tell me what happens in your state, or what happens in our states. Obviously, since you're preparing for your state competitions, or perhaps regional competitions. So know what happens in your state, know about your state government, and know the connections between your state constitution and prior constitutions, say like the 13, because eventually a template was provided to all these other states that came out to the original 13. So look at that and see those connections. And again, this is a history-rich question. So take a look at, I would say, take a look at vices, take a look at the Virginia Plan, then take a look at the national constitution and your state constitution, and see where you can establish some connections.
Professor Moore.
I think I would stress the idea of this is an era of experimentation. There are fixed principles, but there aren't fixed forms. And I think that's the beauty of the 1780s. There are all of these rhetorical similarities as you walk around all these communities. But the forms are, there's tremendous variations. And so to assume that there's a monolithic narrative to constitutionalism, I think Mike raised this point earlier, this is highly experimental in the forms. And so it's kind of, I'm kind of nerdy on all this, but I think it's kind of cool that there isn't a monolithic narrative on forms, even though there is some agreement on principles.
Professor Williams.
I'm going to add on to what Chris and Tim said with just a little bit of a twist. Completely look at your state's constitution. Think about things about how long it is, what's included, how many times has it been amended. I'd be looking at all those things. But because what you're going to find is you're going to find different forms, I think, just over time in your states. Like, you're going to see how those forms change. But I'm not pushing back really. I think there are some general principles. Maybe popular sovereignty or maybe small d democracy is now a principle. But I don't know if we have an agreed upon sort of one size fits all understanding to that. So in addition to the forms, I would ask yourself, where is small d democracy or popular sovereignty showing up in the Constitution? So some I was looking through this, about 45 of the states have some sort of protection for gun rights, but 5 don't, which was interesting, right? We know around abortion, there's a split in what the states are doing. English as an official language. I think I found that there are 8 states that make English the official language. So I think there's really interesting specific issues you can look at around the principle of democracy to analyze your state's constitution, and maybe a comparative one.
Well, there are some excellent insights. The only thing I can add here to students and teachers is that if you're going to use the phrase popular sovereignty, The only way outside of squishy is that anything that's not divine right will qualify as popular sovereignty. So you run with that, students and teachers here. So the next time that we see you, we'll be talking kind of from an international global perspective from Unit 6, and we will have our favorite guest here on the Constitution of American Life. We will also, by I think the next time we see you, students and teachers, we will know which teams will be in the Major League Baseball playoffs. We already know that Professor Moore's team will be there, that my team will be there, and we anxiously await to see if Professor Kavanaugh's team will be in the Major League playoffs. We do know that Professor Williams is not, and some of us celebrate that there kind of stuff. And just to let you know that as we open the show talking about government shutdowns, if the government does shut down, we will not be shut down. We will still be here next session. So until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye-byes.